first, let's get to the situation with the Attorney General that you mentioned, Joe. Jeff Sessions appears to be staying the course, at least for now. This despite attack after attack from the outsider president, who Sessions helped give his first dose of establishment credibility when he was a candidate. There's the whole issue with this president of loyalty. Yesterday morning, during our show, we saw the president fire off tweet after tweet, taking aim at Sessions. And later, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, when asked how long he could continue to criticize Sessions without firing him, he said, quote, "I'm just looking at it. I'll just see. It's a very important thing." And the president downplayed the significance on Sessions' loyalty, saying, quote, "It's not like a great loyal thing about the endorsement." Adding, quote, "When they say he endorsed me, I went to Alabama. I had 40,000 people. He was a senator from Alabama. I won the state by a lot, massive numbers. A lot of states I won by massive numbers. But he was a senator. He looks at 40,000 people and he probably says, what do I have to lose? And he endorsed me. So it's not like a great loyal thing about the endorsement. But I'm very disappointed in Jeff Sessions." Those answers drew deeper questions later in the day.
Well, Mika, why don't we stop right there? I mean, that's just, it's confounding, and it shows just how this man knows no loyalty. Donald Trump does not respect loyalty. He does not give loyalty. Jeff Sessions stuck his neck out early on when the Republican establishment was all against Donald Trump and said he didn't have a chance of winning. But this is how he treats people. He throws them under the bus. And what he doesn't understand, Mark Halperin, is in Washington, D.C., as I had a former old sage tell me in Washington, we're all in a little boat here, Joe, and we all row in a little boat. And if we're not all rowing in the same direction, things get pretty ugly pretty fast. And what goes around comes around. And we're seeing that with Sessions. Could you talk about the other side of this story, though? There's a reason why Breitbart came out yesterday attacking the president and was on the side of Jeff Sessions. There's a reason why there are a lot of Republican conservative, quote, nationalists, the sort of Bannon wing of the party, that started supporting Donald Trump, felt comfortable with Donald Trump, and a lot of that had to do with Jeff Sessions. Right now, what does Donald Trump have to lose by throwing Jeff Sessions overboard and treating him this badly?
Jeff Sessions was, on his career and the issues he's fought for, been the hero of that movement for 2 decades. Donald Trump has been there for about a year and a half, 2 years. And so the loyalty to Sessions runs deep. You saw it on Breitbart yesterday. You see it in a lot of conservative media. I think the president right now is acting very reminiscent of Bill Clinton when he had an independent counsel on his back. It's very easy, as the president suggested, to say, well, this is all about the presidency and the independent counsel's out of control, and he blames Jeff Sessions for that. It's much worse to have an independent counsel going after you than the regular Justice Department for a variety of reasons. And the president's mentality, going after Sessions, even though it goes right to a conflict with his political base, is based on the fact that he's looking for a way out. He's so frustrated by the specter of the independent counsel. And he thinks, contrary to the advice of many of his advisors, that somehow getting rid of Sessions is going to solve his problem. Most people around him are telling him it will only make it worse. Well, they'd like him to patch it up.
He tends to reignite fires around him. And I think there is a lesson here about Washington, Joe, and that is when you're attacking a member of the Senate, you're attacking the entire Senate. You're attacking all of us, is what they will think. Throughout the day, Jeff Sessions got support from Republican members of Congress, in particular, his former Senate colleagues.
I worked with Jeff Sessions for 9.5 years in the Senate. He is one of the most honest people you would ever know. He is a man of very high integrity, and he is an Eagle Scout.
He's a man of courage. He's a man of purpose.
I find him to be a man of integrity.
I think that his independence has been proven by his willingness to recuse himself.
This could have been handled in a different way. We don't need this. It's not good for the president. It's not good for politics in general.
Jeff has been very loyal to the president, and I think he deserves loyalty back.
I personally would strongly recommend against firing Sessions. The fact is that Jeff Sessions was the first senator to support President Trump. He stayed with President Trump when he was 10 points behind, and all the way through the various sports talk tapes and everything else.
I hope the Attorney General doesn't resign. I hope he's not fired. If you look at so much of what the President of the United States wants to accomplish on his agenda, Sessions is central to that.
If President Trump fires Attorney General Sessions, do you think that this Senate will approve whoever he appoints after the fact?
It raises a question about whether or not anybody will want to do it.
Wow.
And Lindsey Graham said in a statement, quote, "Jeff Sessions is one of the most decent people I've ever met in my political life. He's a rock-solid conservative, but above all else, he believes in the rule of law. Jeff understands that we are a nation of laws, not men." On occasion, I vigorously disagreed with Jeff, but I've never once doubted his integrity or sense of fair play. President Trump's tweet today suggesting Attorney General Sessions pursue prosecution of a former political rival is highly inappropriate. Prosecutorial decisions should be based on applying facts to the law without hint of political motivation.
Wow.
To do otherwise is to run away from the long-standing American tradition of separating the law from politics, regardless of party. And Casey Hunt, you hear these Republicans that have stood behind Donald Trump nonstop and defended him when they should not have defended him, when he was defenseless. We've seen it now for 2 weeks. This week it's Jeff Sessions, and they're coming out and they're strongly saying, back off, Mr. President. And we saw some last week do the same thing when he started attacking Robert Mueller. I can only imagine what it sounds like behind the scenes yesterday, what it sounded like yesterday. Tell us how concerned Republicans are with Donald Trump seemingly spinning out of control over this investigation.
I mean, incredibly so, Joe. We've talked all the time about times when the president has seemed to cross lines and whether Republicans would step out in opposition to him. Sometimes you have been critical of them for failing to do it. This is not going to be an area where that happens. For as strong as all of those statements were that we just watched, and as Lindsey Graham's was, it is stronger behind the scenes. I had one aide use the phrase constitutional crisis to talk about what might happen in the event that the president fired Jeff Sessions or that Jeff Sessions resigned. I don't think that there's a way that Republicans would move forward with confirming another attorney general based on the private conversations I had yesterday about it. I do not think that this is a thing that could possibly happen. There's been conversations out of the White House about recess appointments. That's something that, both sides have been blocking recently, and Democrats and Republicans say that's what would happen here. If there was no attorney general, we could go for quite some time without having one. That would have incredible implications.
That would have incredible implications. And Jeremy, you look at all of the people that were speaking out yesterday against Donald Trump's sorry treatment of Jeff Sessions, as we'd say in the South, sorry treatment of Jeff Sessions. And you even had Newt Gingrich, a guy who's, Donald Trump's been a Republican since he discovered birtherism in 2011. Newt Gingrich has been a Republican for a very long time. He understands the special place that Jeff Sessions holds in the Republican Party, for a certain wing of the Republican Party that helped Donald Trump get elected. The Breitbart wing, the Steve Bannon wing. Talk about the impact among the base if he were to fire somebody, and if he continues disrespecting somebody that actually has believed the same things his entire life and fought for them, even back when Donald Trump was giving money to Hillary Clinton, supporting Barack Obama, and giving money to, of course, Chuck Schumer and others.
You hit on the key point there, Joe, which is that Jeff Sessions provided Donald Trump with an awful lot of political cover in the primaries, or before the political primaries, really, when there were conservative Republican voters who looked at Donald Trump and said, I don't know that that guy believes in what I stand for. Jeff Sessions, though, was the embodiment of that conservative nationalist strain of politics that ultimately delivered the White House to Donald Trump. So in distancing himself from Sessions, well, actually, the better way to describe it is cyberbullying. He's cyberbullying Sessions into what he hopes will be his resignation, because he won't say it to his face. He despite this image of being this boardroom tyrant which he's cultivated for himself, he's ultimately conflict averse. So what you're left here is a situation with which the right is starting to break from Trump in a pretty significant way. You have Rush Limbaugh, who's, while not always a leading indicator, is kind of a lagging indicator of where the base is going, saying the other day that he's troubled by this. You have Matt Drudge, as you pointed out. Joe, you have Breitbart, and even Tucker Carlson. These voices on the right that are usually highly deferential to the president are starting to say, this is the one friend you had in Washington, and now you're throwing him under the bus.
So I have a question, Eddie, if you could put your professor hat on, and Elise. It seems to me that there is legal value to recusing yourself from a situation. For example, Jeff Sessions recused himself, felt it was important because of his meetings and to recuse himself from the Russia investigation. The president said yesterday, with a complete serious face, it wasn't joking, it was just, he just said it, that he would have not hired Jeff Sessions if he knew he was going to recuse himself.
Right.
What's the legal value of recusing yourself? Because I feel at the very least, the president was saying, well, if I had known he was going to do the right thing, under the law, I wouldn't have hired him.
Well, there are a couple of things here, right? One is that it's clear that there was a conflict of interest with regards to Senator Sessions and the Russia investigation. So it seems to be unanimity around the fact that he was right in recusing himself. But then to give you a sense of how President Trump thinks, remember one of the ways in which he was attacking Mueller and the lawyers that are investigating the Russia incident or collusion is to say that they had conflict of interest, that they should recuse themselves because they supported the Democratic Party. So we see here he only appeals to the law when it's in his own interest. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, we've always thought about Donald Trump as coming from business world. He is this CEO who can close the deal. Where are his management skills? Why didn't he ask Senator Sessions before he hired him what he would do if this arose? And he obviously he didn't. So now, and he just told us he didn't. And so now he finds himself in this situation.
There are so many situations like this, Elise.
But I think, Mika, what we've seen with President Trump is that in his legal counsel, he does not want officials who are going to uphold the law of the land. He wants lawyers who are going to help him maneuver the law of the land in his favor. And so not uphold our rule of law and just throw it out the window. And it's one thing when it's norms, which I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned about all of the norms surrounding the presidency that this president has just completely destructed and the ethical lapses. But now we're talking about the law, and I think that's when you're really going to see the uprising from Republicans if he does take this if he takes it too far with Jeff Sessions.
And that's Joe when he was talking to the reporters yesterday and answered the question saying, well, I wouldn't have hired him if he had told me he was going to recuse himself. I mean, can't that be translated into, I would not have hired him if he had told me he would respect the law, what's ethically correct, and do the right thing?
Well, I mean, what he's saying is, I would not have hired him if I believed that he had put ethics and the law of the land above Donald Trump's own personal interests. That's what he's saying. And we have had so many examples of this over the past 6 months. Mark Halperin, let's take 3 or so. And the 3 most disturbing because they have to do with his total disrespect for the law. We start with James Comey, a man that he said was a great FBI director when he ruled in his favor, when he did things in his favor. And then he fired him. You look at Rod Rosenstein, who he was calling the smartest guy in Washington, D.C., and loved Rod Rosenstein and expected Rod Rosenstein to allow him and his entire staff to lie about him. And he refused to and appointed Bob Mueller because of it. Suddenly, Rod Rosenstein is a Democrat from Baltimore, and he has no place in the Justice Department. Of course, all those lies, because that's just what Donald Trump seems to do on these investigative situations. Now he's doing it with the Attorney General. This is a 3rd time where he's loyal to a person so long as a person is willing to be unethical for him or check their own ethics at the door. And you can look at Bob Mueller, too. I'm sure we could dig back and find some good things he said about Bob Mueller when he was guiding our country through 9/11. But look at this. There are 4 examples of people that suddenly don't meet Donald Trump's standard when they don't blindly and obsequiously follow Donald Trump's directions. And this is all the more disturbing because this has to do with the rule of law in America.
Yeah, I think again, some people around the president have already figured out, and what I think is dawning on the president, which is why you're seeing him try various means of escape, is that Bob Mueller is not like any other adversary the president's ever faced. He is going to be very, very difficult to besmirch. He's going to be very difficult to intimidate. He's going to be very difficult for the president to stop in any way. And Bob Mueller now is doing a methodical investigation with a lot of very talented lawyers. And while they will try to rough him up by going after various aspects of the background of some of the attorneys working on the case, the problem the president has, which any president has when they're cornered by an independent counsel or special prosecutor, is there is no way to get rid of him and make his life better. He somehow got by getting rid of Comey. He somehow, right for now, is getting by besmirching the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. But Mueller, institutionally and personally, is unlike Marco Rubio, Hillary Clinton, Steve Wynn. He's unlike anyone the president's ever had to try to face down.
Or a cable host.
And the biggest problem is, Mika, the biggest problem for him is his argument is that Bob Mueller may have contributed once to Democrat and people that he hired may have delivered or made contributions to Democrats. You have the President of the United States and the White House communication director who together have given money to Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, the DNC, hundreds of thousands of dollars to the DNC between both of them, Harry Reid, Barack Obama, Rahm Emanuel, Chuck Schumer. I mean, if you really want to line up what the president and the White House communications director, their donations to Democrats, and Bob Mueller and his team's donations to Democrats, I have no doubt whatsoever that the President of the United States and the White House communications director have given more money to Democrats and Democratic institutions throughout their lives than Bob Mueller's team has. So that argument just doesn't work. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.